First off, thank you very much for having me. I appreciate everyone coming this evening to see me. I first want to thank the Ukrainian Institute London and the School of Slavonic and Eastern European Studies, University College London, for organizing this event and finding me to be a suitable speaker to talk to you about this subject. And I also want to thank everyone in the audience for taking time out of your very busy schedules. You all came through the rain to see me. I'm very grateful that you were willing to get wet and endure this rainy weather to see me. I think we should never underestimate people's interest in their efforts to visit someone. And it really speaks to the fact that people are very much energized about this new idea that we're all working together about what it means to decolonize and centering Ukraine in its own struggle for liberation. And I also want to thank my private teacher, his name is Joshua Remy, for coaching me in my intellectual journey and helping me to prepare for today's talk, and my manager, Silai Abrams, who books my talks and ensures that I'm well prepared, off by talking about what it means to decolonize Western coverage of Ukraine and what that means. And I need to discuss the word colonization from a very specific standpoint and broaden it to why we are here and what we want to talk about in regards to coverage. And I'm going to really wrap this around my own experience as an independent journalist. And that's very important because being an independent journalist and using the voice that I have to finance my own reporting is going to give you a very different perspective from mainstream coverage, which sticks to more traditional tools and mechanisms of disseminating information. That's a very important level of distinguishment to make. But the general term of decolonization is the process by which colonies become independent from their colonizing country. But the wider terms is basically the undoing of colonialism, and the latter being the process whereby, and this is from Wikipedia, which has done a combination of the definitions, which I like. The process whereby imperial nations establish and dominate foreign territories, often overseas, and some scholars decolonization focus especially on the independence movements in the colonies and the collapse of the global colonial empires, and some scholars extend it to include the economic, cultural, and psychological aspects of the colonial experience, which we'll be talking about. And the decolonization scholars apply the framework to the struggles against the coloniality of power within cellular colonial states, even after successful independence movements. That last part, I think, is very important for us to talk about Ukraine, because when you think about the dissolution of the USSR, the process of empire that we saw this year with this invasion of Russia is a continuation of that fall. And so it didn't end in 1991, obviously. But I want to talk about what do I mean when I say decolonizing Western media coverage. More specifically, it means embracing the local indigenous scholars of Russian colonialism and embracing the stories of Ukrainian liberation, which we're talking about today, and those other countries that were colonized under Soviet rule. And it actually means spending less time pursuing Western commentary that focuses on the U.S. response to Ukraine and more time embracing non-traditional voices whose activism speaks to the life of their experience. And why is that important? And that really gets to where I'm going to talk about in my remarks about how the West got Ukraine's resistance wrong. And during my time leading up to the war in Ukraine, one of the things that you don't get on mainstream networks are the full remarks of President Vladimir Putin and how we in Ukraine listen to them each and every day. You get 30 seconds or maybe 45 seconds of his words. And it's interesting being a Black journalist who covers racism in America, the the degradation and the putting down and the flat out denial of the Ukrainian people in itself reflects very much some of the similar white supremacist structures that I covered as a reporter covering politics in the United States. And one of the takeaways I want us to really embrace is that even though the struggles of Black Americans, Latinx people, are different stories, one thread that they all share is the relationship to power and those who are not willing to give up their oppression, their oppressive attitudes towards people who they think are lower than them. That's where the threads match. Another point is start doing, and also what we're doing is we are looking at Ukraine and other colonies of Russia as what they were, as colonies that were that were in the Union under force, and calling an institution for what it is. And this is going to get to the tougher part of my remarks, because when you think about decolonizing coverage of Ukraine, particularly from the Western angle, you're dealing with nations that have their own issues of colonialism, including England, including the United States, including France, where where the conversations around race about the countries that they formerly occupied are still in denial by a lot of main power structures. And so it's going to be very challenging to decolonize Western media coverage of Ukraine when many of the very Western journalists that traveled to Ukraine have not gone through their own personal decolonization. And one of the things that we will discuss is there are lessons, I think, from the Black Lives Matter movement that have informed my coverage and my understanding of Ukraine. And then finally, as a Western journalist who was traveling across the country, one of the things that is fought in addition to a military war, which is what is getting all the attention, is that of the cultural warfare that Ukraine is also fighting. And what do I mean by that? There is a conversation, and I'm saying this as somebody who traveled around Ukraine, and I'm open to having a conversation with the audience about this, is that after the first invasion of Ukraine in 2014, to me, there was very much it seemed to be like a cultural renaissance that Ukrainians were going through themselves in regards to embracing Ukrainian language, for example. In fact, I'm learning Ukrainian language right now, and just really interrogating its relationship with Moscow. And one of the ways in which I, as a journalist, have learned to properly and respectfully chronicle that experience is by not being in Moscow. It sounds really simple. It sounds very simple, but it isn't. If we as journalists, particularly those from America, don't really understand power dynamics, particularly in our own country, and if we don't understand and recognize power dynamics in our own country, we can apply them when we're going abroad. So what I want to do is go some tweets, and I didn't add this into my slideshow, but I'm going to start with some words from a Ukrainian journalist named Nika Milkozarova. And her words were this: the USSR was not Russia. USSR was a monster union of some 15 states, most of whom served whom were subjugated and served Russian interests. Moscow was the center, Russia was the only official language. And so she goes on to say that this is a daily reminder that would help you understand why most of us, i.e. Ukrainians, in quote unquote Russia's backyard, as you would like to call us, are fed up with Russians and why we are doing what we are doing. And so I bring up her tweet because it reminds me of activist language that was used during various Black Lives Matter protests, and the language of understanding Black Americans as having a very distinct history and a very distinct battle against America's white supremacist constructs. And that was a very challenging task for journalists in the United States to grapple with, because, and particularly when you're dealing with journalists that are predominantly white and who don't recognize their privilege. And so that was a challenge, primarily because you had to have uncomfortable conversations about power in your relationship with it. And what I'm going to argue, and what I'm saying here is that for a lot of journalists who up until recently were based in Ukraine, because you see the Washington Post, you see other major networks that are putting journalists and bureaus in Kyiv, right? And much of that, of course, had to do with the business of covering Ukraine. It's just more convenient, but my belief is that it was because Ukrainians themselves kept insisting on centering themselves in that we are no longer a subject of Moscow. To the another slide, and this scholar spent a lot of time talking about the phrase imperial innocence. And Whitaker Yakova is a Central Asian scholar who has been doing a lot of work talking about Ukraine. And I think that her use of the terms imperial innocence is very important for how we should cover and understand Ukraine. The main issue with Western coverage is that it tends to play both sides, which in itself is this idea that there's objectivity in coverage. And the reality is that as human beings, we don't have the capacity to be objective. And we don't like to acknowledge that, but I think the best that we can do is be fair and to be forthright with our perspectives. But Whitaker's use of imperial innocence is very important. And I'm going to read what she says. She says, the Russian state has no incentive to deal with its imperialism, but neither, it seems, does Russian society or Russian academia. The reason for the reluctance to grapple with Russia's imperialism, past and current, is that Russia has not undergone colonization. In the 1990s, when the Soviet Union past was still critically debated, the pre-Soviet past was idealized in popular imagination, and the Soviet Union was not perceived as an empire. She goes on to say that, according to this self-representation, Russia did not attack and colonize, but liberated, enslaved, and colonized. The Soviet imperial discourse in Central Asia, for example, told the local population that they were liberated from Russian Tsarism and prevented from falling prey to British colonialism. But the Soviet imperial myth did not break with the Russian Tsarism myth of liberation. Instead, it built on it. So, if you were in Ukraine during the lead up to the war, and just to give you all inside view of what it's like to be inside someone's kitchen in Ukraine, you're listening to the messages leading up to the war, and just letting you all know, no one actually believed that this war was going to happen until it actually did, in many instances. And so there was a lot that Putin said throughout the, leading up to the war, but the main thing that struck me was Putin's insistence on Ukraine not existing. And I think that when you hear that talk, you instantly have to you instantly have to look at this and say that this is not only a military invasion, these are the words that are the beginning of a genocide and the erasure of a people, because he literally says it. And so when you think about the term of decolonization, it really has a lot to deal with recognizing that it's not both sides. It's not a conflict, right? It's an invasion, and the both sidesism of coverage has to immediately be put to the side, right? Is that when covering Ukraine, it was and talking to Western media about this, the challenge for me was convincing the analysts and the hosts that Ukraine was not going to fall. And how was I able, what experience and what knowledge did I bring to that conversation? And I take it back to 2014. And actually I'll get to this. 2014, you think about Maidan and Ferguson and the power of activism. That year, 2014, was very much a critical year for both Ukraine and the United States. In that, with the case of Ukraine, there are several signs that told us early on about the power and how strong the institutions of Ukraine were, and how that led to my conclusion that Ukraine was not going to fall. You can test a nation's capacity to endure trauma by how strong its civil society holds up. And in 2000, the digital Maidan, it began obviously with the administration of Viktor Yanukovych turning down or rejecting a series of European Union agreements. And that started off with protests, and then, in November, and then they got more intense, and then, then we obviously saw the Maidan. But the signs were that the signs were, to me, how they responded to police, how protesters on Maidan responded to police violence. And the work of Sophia Wilson, and I'm putting these names up so everyone can reference, I'm kind of showing my work a little bit, is she's a political scientist at Southern Illinois University, and her work pretty much talks about how the Maidan protests actually ratcheted up as a result, not necessarily in response to the European Union, but the ways in which the state abused protesters. And we obviously saw the ouster of Viktor Yanukovych. So my footnote on that is, if Ukrainians were willing to risk their lives and die to kick out someone who they felt essentially was selling out their country, there was not going to be much tolerance for a foreign invader to do the same. Is that one of the reasons why Ukraine's military is doing so well is in large part to how strong its civil society is developed. Why is this important? In 2014 and 15, I was covering Ukraine's military development. And before 2014, I've had Ukrainian officials tell me something that's well known, basically, that Ukraine was only a military on paper. What's missing in the conversation now is that Ukraine was able to strengthen its institutions slowly and steadily over the years. And because of that, they were ready to engage the West and engage these and engage military hardware. And so it's important to note that because in leading up to the war, the second invasion, I was explaining this to people and saying that, Ukrainians have been fighting Russia for the past 8 years. They know how to fight them. They also have been improving their issues with corruption. Of course, there is issues here. It's not perfect. But in the past 8 years, what's happening in Ukraine is nothing short of a miracle. And so, if you don't live here, if you don't constantly study Ukrainian culture and Ukrainian civil society, you're not going to have the knowledge to understand how people are going to actually respond. And and then another issue is that many of the traditional Western think tank institutions are not equipped with the right personnel to assess Ukraine as an individual country. I say this because, and I'm not going to spend that much time talking about Russia because it's about Ukraine and understanding its own individual agency and understanding it, but I had a very vigorous conversation with a particular think tank, which I will not name, and if we're using this framework that Russia, in order to really interrogate Russia and what it's doing to Ukraine, you can't disconnect that from the Russian psyche. Why is this uncomfortable? Because the similar language in America, the ways in which Ukrainians talk about Russia is a similar way that Black Americans talk about whiteness and white supremacy. And you can't disconnect the two. And so, in a conversation about interrogating what it means to be Russian, and I'm using the language from my Ukrainian colleagues, is that you're not only making the quote unquote average Russian uncomfortable, you're making scholars who devoted their time to this field looking at Ukraine through a Moscow lens also uncomfortable. And so the reason why you keep seeing Russia being censored is because even though they understand the need to change, that there needs to be a change in Russia, they don't embrace decolonization. And why is that? It's because much of the ways that Westerners view the world is through a neoliberal construct. There's a whole bunch of definitions about what neoliberalism is, but what it doesn't do is it does not censor local indigenous voices, right? And it does not really, it's very much a top-down scheme, and it does not really employ institutional and local ecosystems. And so I had this conversation with the think tank about Alexei Navalny, and I wrote a piece that a lot of people found controversial, which I basically said I don't trust him. And the reason why is that, and this is really going to bring it home, what Ukrainians are talking to me about, what I've learned in my reporting, they're talking about a decolonization. They're talking about and what that means is that they're talking about a system shift, a cultural shift. Alexei Navalny is regime change. They're two very different things. The ways in which America covered Ferguson, I'm looking at the time to make sure that we're good on it. I'll be done in about 10 minutes. But the issue here is that with Ferguson in 2014, prior to that, and by the way, Ferguson, it was Mike Brown was a black teenager who was shot and killed by a police officer from the town of Ferguson. And prior to 2014, mainstream media pretty much had a strong hold on ways in which race was discussed. And his body strewn across the, on the street. And it was local people and then later activists who were streaming this very graphic and grisly scene. And they actually beat mainstream media and local media to the punch. And you saw these stories being told on their own. And so therefore, while there was a clash between this new digital media and activists taking on the mantle of being a journalist. And but what it did was that it really forced much of white America to have uncomfortable conversations about race, because people use digital platforms to take a nice share of the intellectual media market. Maybe not necessarily from a corporate perspective, but from an intellectual framework of being able to manage their voice and editorialize on their own accord. They were able to challenge mainstream media narratives, which is what I think Ukraine is doing. And so I bring these two together to talk about the fact that the Ukrainians took a great and golden opportunity, and still are, in framing their stories. The difference is that the Western journalist who comes to Ukraine is not able to have that same, that uncomfortable conversation about hearing Ukrainians talk about Russian colonialism, the discomfort of what it means to live under Russian rule in the sphere of Russia, in the same way that we have conversations about race. And so the media coverage of Black America shifted, not because mainstream media just had a change of heart. It changed because they were forced to. And the decolonization conversation forces traditional networks, people who held on to their, their traditional jobs, the people who think glowingly about the times when they studied in St. Petersburg and Saratov and Moscow during the 80s and 70s and 60s and God knows how long. So I think that what the digital space is doing is bringing that uncomfortable conversation directly to them, and they can't avoid it. To really close this out, I think that the main thing is that when you think about the decolonization process, we really have to think about the cultural war. And we have to think about the cultural warfare that's happening here. And I wanted to recognize the Ukrainians' voices that I recognized, mainly the Anti-Corruption Action Center in Ukraine. Some of these organizations that have been fighting corruption and talking about how important it is to have, about what the lead up was to Ukraine's successful response to Russia. And Daria Kaleniuk, for example, and colleagues, and Lena Tribub, who also focuses on military corruption. And she's the one who I interviewed for a story, for BuzzFeed, by the way. And my colleagues at Ukrainian Spaces. And so these are people who center these, what you call indigenous voices, not just Ukrainian voices. It's voices from countries that were formerly colonized under Moscow. And the reason why I like their platform so much is that the colonization process, for me, that I see them doing very much resembles what I see in America. It centers Black America. The Black Lives Movement centers Black lives, but What I really believe is that Black liberation liberates everyone. Ukrainian liberation liberates everyone. It can work, and so I am, let me see, I think I'll skip this one. But basically, I'll quote, another thing is, I wrote this and it generated a whole lot of controversy. In 2017, I talk about how Putin and Russia are using Soviet-era tricks to avoid racist white fears. In order to really understand the decolonization process here, and I'm speaking from the perspective of a journalist covering Ukraine, is that I really had to appreciate that what Ukraine is fighting is a cultural war. What do I mean by that? I'm not going to get too much into, the Tanky community and these people who just straight up deny Ukrainian genocide. But one of the things that Ukraine is dealing with is falsehoods about who they are as a people. And I bring this up because, and what this starts off with is a straight up denial of your history, a revisionist, and a historical version of history. It's very much how Donald Trump came to power in the United States. And its lack of, and much of media's lack of capacity to understand that in addition to Trump's racism, he also engaged in a cultural war that was very effective. And Russia is doing the same thing. I see an opportunity for Ukraine, particularly when you think about the engagement with the continent of Africa, to make a choice that it will be a better steward of brotherhood than the Kremlin claims to be. And I'll finish here, but I think that Ukraine, in my travels, have had a really great opportunity to really reverse the Western lens about how it should be centered. And I'm happy that I was a part of it. So I am ready to take any of your questions. I'm very happy that you sat through this, and I hope that I was able to string together these threads to make sense. And if not, I'll be more than happy to clarify during the Q&A.
Thank you so much. Which of your experiences are informing this perspective? What allows you to be this voice and to be the voice for us as well?
Okay, so before I went to Ukraine, I went to a country, Georgia, country I was there as a Peace Corps volunteer. And ironically, I was supposed to have gone to Russia as a Peace Corps volunteer, but they kicked out the program in 2000 because they accused the Peace Corps program of being spies. By the way, U.S. Peace Corps is a volunteer program where people are sent to a number of countries around the world for 2 years to volunteer as teachers, NGO development, etc. And when I went to Georgia, which everyone thought I was going to Atlanta, I'll tell you something I never really forgot. And one of the things I have to do is I have to tell you about my own growth. And this has a lot to do with Ukraine. When I look at first when I looked at Georgians, Ukrainians, I'm like, okay, these are all white people and they all get along, right? I grew up in Detroit, Michigan, the largest black city in the United States of America. I went to a historically black college. I lived a very black African-American centric life and spent a lot of time around white people, white skin, whatever. And so Georgia expanded my knowledge of what race means, right? And ironically, a lot of people like to claim that race does not exist in Russia and Russia doesn't racialize, the countries that colonized, which is nonsense because the word Raza appeared in Russian scholarship and periodicals as early as in the 1830s, at least. But I was going around Georgia, and this was during the invasion of 2008 by Russia. And I was in Batumi, and the guys, some guys tried to get my attention. There was like 6 or 7 of them. Startled me. And then we started talking about, they said that they were in Moscow for a week, and they couldn't stay because they were fighting skinheads all the time. And the guy said, Tadayevny, which is my Georgian name. And he said, in Russia, we're black like you. I was like, first, no, you're not. But here's the point that I want people to understand. It really opened up my lens about, it really opened up my thought about how race is deployed outside of America. So it was the precursor of the invasion of Russia, the invasion of Georgia, that prepared me to understand Ukraine. And the best decision that ever happened for me, right, was that I did not complete my 2 years of Peace Corps in Russia. And so that was the best thing that could have ever happened to me. And so also in Ukraine, I had a number of stories, and I like telling it because I think it resonates. And I was in Ukraine and in Lviv, Western Ukraine, and I was with my Fulbright group. It's like 20 or 30 of us, only black guy in the crowd. This old man, really old, walked up to me, and he shook my hand, and said, "Hey, do you know," and he said it in Russian. He said, "Do you want to know the history of Ukraine?" Who comes up to you in the middle of the day? and of all, he didn't go to the Ukrainians, he came to me. "Do you want to know the history of Ukraine?" I said, "Sure." And he started off by saying that he said Ukraine for Russia has always been a colony of Moscow, and they want to oppress us. And they're going to do it again eventually. This is 2010. And he just started going on and on about Russians wanting to colonize us and colonize us. What was going through my brain was that I saw in my mind a white man coming up to me and telling me about how his white, quote unquote, the white person, in Russia was trying to oppress him. I think it's important for me to tell you this because we have to go down to the base of what it means to understand what decolonization means, because the first mistake that I made initially when I came to this world is assuming that just because they look like they are wrong, right? And a lot of people don't want to admit that ignorance, but it's true, right? And so I went on this intellectual sojourn to really understand how people in the eastern part of Europe responded to this Russian, this oppression, and moved forward to that. I think I was speaking too long, but
That's brilliant. Yeah, answered my question, but I'll still ask it. There is this difficulty in embracing the anti-colonial dimension of Ukrainian struggle. What are we as Ukrainians probably doing wrong? What are we not communicating in order for Russia, first of all, to be understood as a former empire, and for us to be understood as fighting against the neo-imperialist war?
Thank you for that question. I appreciate it. I think that this responsibility is not up to Ukrainians, it's up to us as Westerners to understand the people that we're covering. That's the fundamental issue. It's one of those things where I worked in African-American media, African-American owned, African-American centered media for much of my career. And one of the main reasons why I did that was because I didn't feel like having to argue and debate with some white journalists who didn't understand who I was as a person and why my existence mattered and why I had all these grievances and antipathies towards whiteness. Okay, I just did not want to do that. To this day, I have no interest in doing that. And I think again, going back to 2014 Ferguson, what Ferguson taught mainstream media, especially the white ones, especially white commentators, is that it put our issues front and center, and it changed, and it empowered people to change. It empowered activists to change the narrative. The reality is that Western media coverage centers power brokers. It's very up down. And talking to people like you or Ukrainians, I mean, listen, Ukrainians are the people who are dealing with war. You would think that they would be centered in all these conversations, right? Doesn't. Had the same experience in America, where it wasn't uncommon to find white people talking about racism about black people, and occasionally having that one black person to bring the black perspective. I don't think that it's Ukrainians doing everything wrong. It's a multi-pronged process whereby Western journalists, we have to decolonize ourselves. Going back to your first question, the best way for me to understand Ukraine was to deconstruct my own ignorance about how I thought about people outside of America and how I had to view power dynamics in this part of the world. I had to do that work. So I would not encourage Ukrainians to encourage my Western colleagues' laziness. I would instead encourage people like yourself and others to take Western coverage to task, because that's the only way it's going to change.
I'm still
being honest. These conversations are painful, and one example I give when I talk about so much of how I view Ukraine, I went through my own growth process as a journalist, and we all have to do that, right? For example, the thing about the Black Lives Matter movement, it didn't just focus on black people and skin color, it focused on LGBTQ rights. It focused on fighting anti-trans sentiment. It also focused on the poor, what it means to be, what it means to live in a world where you're disabled. And so there are so many intersections in this movement that, yes, the black is the first thing that you see, but there are different types of blackness, and those different types of experiences impact everyone. And so there are, and it also dealt with misogyny, right? As a journalist, I had to take my own self to task and disentangle myself from structures of oppression. In many cases, they were unknowingly, that dealt with, xenophobia, that dealt with, again, with sexuality. And so it made me a better journalist to cover that movement made me a better journalist to cover myself. And until you do that within your own country, you can't decolonize, you can't talk about decolonization and having this lens towards Ukraine if you don't do it yourself. And simply most people are not willing to do that work to cover suffers, which is why it's incumbent upon Ukrainians to push it, because no one changes, unfortunately, without being taken to task and usually, being pressured to do so.
in our conversation before we came to the audience that obviously we were not surprised that Kiev did not fall in 3 days, Ukraine did not fall in 3 days, because you paid attention to cultural resistance, to social resistance. You know how cultural resistance works. Maybe you could speak a little bit more about that, and maybe there is something that actually did surprise you.
Oh boy, my surprises, I still have not processed them, but let me deal with your first part of the question. So, here's the cultural resistance. Again, you heard me earlier talk about Maidan from 2014. One of the things that I learned about Ukrainians is that they have consistently paid the price and died for their liberation. And wow, so I'm just going to get you into, so part of this is just being in Ukraine, living there, because I live in Ukraine part-time, 45 months out of the year, and we have I have conversations with many of my Ukrainian friends about Russia. And sometimes I share with them the work of my colleagues, and we talk about the Russian opposition. We're not going to get into them, but I'm going to talk about how my Ukrainian colleagues respond, and their words are very simple. They get very furious when they talk about, well, you Russians are afraid and Russians don't want to risk their lives. And my Ukrainian friend said, they can go and die. We die. And I said, well, so many people were in prison. They said, well, can Putin imprison the whole country? And he said, well, and then I remember one of my friends particularly said, if 100 protesters die, go out again and die some more, and die some more, and die some more, and die some more. Regardless of their social-economic class, whether I'm having this conversation in Russian and I'm switching to Ukrainian, or if I'm having it, it doesn't matter. Ukrainians say, go die. I don't care. And they back it up. So, and that's the first sign. And I really think that I think that 2014, and again, maybe it's just me, but post-Maidan Ukraine, especially Kiev, it felt like a different world to me. It did not feel the same, and I don't have the words. But in addition to this civil society buildup, there were these conversations where, it didn't matter what part of the country I was in, that people were constantly in conversations about not only holding themselves accountable, but their governments accountable. And what you saw in Ukraine, which I think was different, what was different from Georgia, because on the Black Sea coast, and I hope there are no Jordans here because I'm going to say some things that you don't like. Because I lived in Georgia for 3 years, and I know the country very well. Ukraine's civil society was not linked to a particular personality, right? And in fact, my read on Ukrainian civil society in regards to improving institutions and better elections was very disjointed emotionally from whoever was in power, which is something that was very different in Georgia in the case of Mikhail Saakashvili. And the biggest irony of the Black Sea is that, this dynamic is that what's happening in Ukraine is what people thought a continuation of Georgia would be. So you saw this major shift in who the West is paying attention to now. But so as far as it's the conversations with my friends, the conversations about the civil society constantly improving, which I think is very important. I think it's underestimated, but the important thing is that in order to really be inclusive of civil society, you have to have the right people. Like from a Western perspective, I don't think that a lot of our think tanks and our former government officials are intellectually equipped to understand that civil society and the culture behind that really fuels what we're seeing today. That requires knowledge of activism. That requires knowledge of, again, what does decolonization mean? That means knowledge of understanding that that the history of Ukrainian independence didn't start in 1991. It engaged in hundreds of years, and that Ukrainians' history is absolutely distinct from that of Russia. And you notice that by simply traveling the country.
Which not all of them are willing to do.
But again, I live in Western Ukraine. I've spent months there every year, and I travel around the country, and it's just very clear just by looking at the topography of the country. It's completely distinct. And the only thing that's Russian there are the Soviet buildings that Moscow built. Other than that, there's a truly distinct Ukrainian sense that's always existed, and my surprise was, think about the surprises. I think, people ask me, what was it like being a Black person there? And of course, I'm doing a series on Black people who are traveling, who fled the war there. That's an entirely different conversation, which has its own unfortunate stories of racism and discrimination, not only in Ukraine, but also across Europe. Again, it's a different conversation. But for me individually, since it's about me, my surprise was, I guess my surprise is how well Ukrainians treated me while I was covering Ukraine. My first few days were with the Territorial Defense Unit, and it was my first time doing military reporting. And as dangerous as that work is, I enjoyed working with Ukrainians that were fighting for the liberation of their country, because they embraced me. You know, I was one of them. You know, if they had shots, they did anything, like they just brought me in, and I was like one of them. And then in cases where things got hairy and sticky, they protected me. Like there's a camaraderie, and I was just surprised that I would be so enthralled by that camaraderie in the middle of a war, including the times when bullets were flying and I was missing a Russian missile strike. I experienced all that. But finally, there's a policeman at a checkpoint, and checking our passports. So I was American. He left at this. And he looked at me, and here's the important context. The way that a lot of people check to see if you're a spy is if you can speak Ukrainian. You know, so for example, I'm telling you because I'm learning Ukrainian, and you don't know it until you get the language, which is why the decolonisation part is very important. So in Russian, there's this letter, in Russian it's G, and then Ukrainian is P. And if you're not Ukrainian, if you don't practice it, you can miss it very easily. And so you go through these checkpoints, and they all speak to you in Ukrainian. I didn't speak Ukrainian at that point. But I was with some, guys in Territorial Defense Unit, and the guy looked at me and said, well, it's okay. It's very clear that you're not a Muscovite. He just let me go. But I just really kept up there.
So much, Terrell. I'm one of your Twitter followers, and I found you.
Thank you. I don't even know all these people, but thank you so much.
And so I found you just at the beginning. It says it's full-scale wave, so I had not seen your work before. But I found it refreshing that it was a different point of view on the war in the country. And my question is about this. We are speaking about analyzing Western media, and I suppose people who speak for Ukraine. But a lot of things that they get wrong, they also get sometimes kind of right. There's a lot of work that's being done in Ukraine on the issues that we have. Corruption is the one which you mentioned, but there's also the issue of racism, the issue of hate towards certain minorities, LGBTQ plus groups, etc. And I think a lot of Western media pick up on that because there are instances of that and evidence of that. And my question is, what is the work that Ukrainian media and Ukrainian people who work in public policy, people who are activists, what can they be doing now? Instead of saying that it's not, we have this phrase, chassis, maybe it's not
the right time.
It's not the right time for it because there is war. It's not the right time to talk about these issues. There is war, What is the work that Ukrainian people who are speaking out that they have to be doing to combat that wrong and twisted and maybe sometimes justified and sometimes unjustified coverage from the Western media?
Thank you very much. That's a very good question, and you gave me the opportunity to kind of delve into my reporting that I'm doing on Black refugees who fled Ukraine. And so I'll give a direct question about the racism and ways that Ukrainians can respond and work to deal with the subject. First, I can tell you that when I first went to Ukraine, my very first day, I experienced housing discrimination. This is 2009. I think it's better now, much better now. But I experienced housing discrimination. The first 7 people I went to ask for an apartment turned me down, right? And he straight up told me, we don't rent to Black people. Now, I bring this, and it takes a particular type of person. If you are a Black person, even somebody who's as supportive as me, you have to have a particular intestinal fortitude, and even under the best of circumstances, to not only live in Ukraine, but Eastern Europe in general, right? And you feel the difference as I was traveling, and I want to get into my reporting of Black refugees. And I'm going to really bring home to a really central point that I really want people to be left with. When this crisis at the border took place, and when I talk about border, the border stretches from, Poland on down to Romania. So when we talk about the border, we have to realize how wide the border is. Going into the European Union, is that there are different experiences between how people of color were able to leave versus Ukrainians, and also how they received in their host countries. So I've interviewed dozens of people for my series that's going to publish on my podcast in February. And every single person who told me, that most of them were Nigerians who traveled to Ukraine because, many of them are medical students. It was affordable, and they generally enjoyed Ukraine. Many of them established lives, got permanent residency, temporary residency. It was a good life for them. And they all told me that. They saw the ugly side of Ukraine when this war broke. Because when people are under stress, you really see who they are. That's with all of us. And with Ukraine, it was the extreme racism of fellow refugees that were trying to get on the trains, first of all. And one of the main points that these refugees were telling me, and they're all spread around around the European Union, was that even if you were, the idea was, okay, we need to get women and children out. Black people who were black women who are pregnant were literally pushed off these trains, and then also you had situations where Black people, and people have shown me videos of this where they were literally beaten by police officers, Ukrainian police officers. And one person had a story of where a Ukrainian came and urinated on them. It gets worse, right? But here's the point of it. In addition to that, these refugees face racism when they enter the European Union. One person in Berlin told me that police forced them to strip naked. They saw, and Black Ukrainians told me that their Ukrainianness was denied because, again, if you had a Ukrainian passport, that was supposed to save you. For many Black Ukrainians, it didn't, because it's not beyond the fact that people were accusing them of not being Ukrainian and fake passports. In one instance in Paris, one Black Ukrainian told me that the Ukrainians were saying really racist things about her in Russian, saying that what is this N-word doing here with us Ukrainians? And then when she responded back in Russian and Ukrainian, they just were kind of, shocked, right? So I'm bringing all this to say that these things definitely happen. It was an opportunity for Ukraine to really respond back by wanting anything to happen. Because the irony in this very reflexive response was that Ukrainians wanted Westerners to sympathize with them, but did not have enough in themselves to sympathize with fellow refugees that were running away from the same enemy. So when we talk about decolonization, we all have to take these steps in decolonizing our own ignorance. And it doesn't matter if it's during a war, because other peoples have done it, and that's my kind of take the task moment. What I see, and I also see this as an opportunity, because, Ukraine, one of the things that Russia is doing, because in reality, we all know Russia doesn't care about Africa. We all know that that racism is not only a Ukrainian thing. My reporting on these Black refugees has more to do with, one, recognizing their stories just as much as I recognize Ukrainian stories, but also it's an opportunity for Ukraine, because again, I included Black Ukrainian voices because So one of the criticisms would be, well, these people should go back to their country. There are plenty of Black Ukrainians who say, well, this is my country. And many of them are telling me that they don't want to go back based on how they're treated. I see this as an opportunity for Ukrainian civil society to become stronger, not weaker. And the way in the solution is by not doing what your oppressor does, which is acting in denial and lying and disvaluing people's experiences. That's a very tough conversation, but it's one that I think Ukrainians have to have, because just as Ukraine needs support from the West to liberate itself, Ukrainians are going to have to do what other nations have done under this extreme pressure, which is recognizing their own institutions of racism, xenophobia, that can erode their own institutions. I hope that helps.
My name is Cardi, I'm a lawyer and writer. Just picking up on a couple of themes that you just talked about. You said that we all know that Russia doesn't care about Africa. And of course, I mean, I believe that. I think most of us in this room probably believe that. But that's not the narrative that Russia is putting out. And it's also not the narrative that plenty of people believe, unfortunately, around the world. I mean, the Putin made a speech a month ago where he talked a lot about the colonial West, about the importance of decolonisation. And then in the aftermath of there was an attack on the Black Sea, on parts of the Black Sea Fleet a couple of days ago. And I think it was Petrushov, or the Ministry of Agriculture, said that Russia is going to, they talked about ending the grain agreement, but said that Russia is going to be, is going to feed the hungry nations of the world for the next 4 months for free. Now, as far as I'm concerned, but I do think that it's something which a lot of parts of the undeveloped world, whatever one wants to call it, are buying. I mean, I was talking to a refugee, a friend, it was just at a party, but a guy who left Syria a while ago. He hates Putin, obviously. I mean, I can't remember which town he was, well, he was from Damascus, I don't know which towns he went through. He was perfectly aware of the chemical warfare that Russia has been using there and the atrocities that Russia's committed there. But he told me that the narrative was working in parts of the Middle East, and he, this is a slightly different theme, but he was also concerned about the way that Ukraine, the coverage of the situation in Ukraine was getting priority over the problems in Syria. That is a different thing, I said. But I just wondered, going back to the main point about the fact that Russia is trying to portray itself as a provider for the underdeveloped world, and trying to build on in the kind of fake way that Putin does, trying to build on certain positive aspects of the Soviet legacy. I just wondered if you thought that if that was something that in Ukraine is being countered, could be countered.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So here's the thing. First of all, Russia actually tried to colonize the continent of Africa. There's a scholar, a Ukrainian scholar, that deals with this work, and his name is amazing. Actually, I could actually teach a whole course about these ways in which, the Kremlin is much better at telling a lie than many countries are at telling the truth. That's a fundamental problem, right? And this is something that I found in my reporting. You're actually getting a sneak peek into my reporting because it deals directly with your question. Nigeria is the largest country, it's the most populous country in the continent, and so the thing that Russia and its various political iterations, for good, via the Tsarist period, the Soviet Union in particular, they have done a really good job at taking on Africa's grievance towards the West. And the way that Russia does this is that in the same breath that Ukraine is getting its, much needed aid from Western countries. Those are the same countries that colonized and destroyed much of the continent of Africa, right? And so Ukrainians, savior, so to speak, is Africa's devil. If you are Ukrainian, you have to understand that, right? You have to understand that your ally has long been the continent of Africa's oppressor. And it's true. If you're not willing to do that, you're not going to approach this with the requisite intellectual depth that's required. That is something that many of my colleagues have a hard time embracing, because you're basically asking, the typical think tank scholar, whether it be in London or Washington or New York or Brussels, that they're a colonizer. How do you have that conversation, right? But you have to. And so, one, for Ukraine, it has to be so what it has to do is it just has to recognize these truths. And the major problem with Ukraine's response to this coverage of African students is that they went into denial mode that was very, very bad. And that has caused, and we all know that racism doesn't exist just in Ukraine. And that's my biggest beef. I have no problem. I'm dedicating a whole series that's taking months of my time. I have no problem talking about the racism. I do have a problem by saying that Ukraine is ground zero. Right? But you still have to, but because you're in this major moment, all good, that's right. That reminds me of one of the territorial defense guys that accidentally shot my foot off with an assault rifle, but it's just water. It's okay.
Not surprising.
Yeah, it's not surprising. I'm not surprised. You know what? It's all good. But my point here, but to close on your question, is that you start the way to deal with Russia's hold on the continent of Africa is by doing better engagement. It's a lot of catch up. They can do it, but the main thing you start with is resisting that knee-jerk reaction to deny the truth. But also, I learned, and this me personally, I learned a lot, even talking to many of my Ukrainian friends. I've had this conversation with some people who I wouldn't call, many of them I would say friends or people I've met once or twice who respected me on social media. When I started talking about racism, many of them kind of turned on me, and I said, am I somebody who you respect, or am I your mascot? In many instances, people saw me as this kind of, I'm speaking on Ukrainian, in solidarity, but when I talk about issues that affect me as a person or people who look like me, you're spreading Russian propaganda. So again, am I somebody who you genuinely respect, or am I your mascot? I was clearly your mascot for some of these people. And that's in addition to me revealing the truth, that's something that they have to deal with on their own. It's not my place to do that work for them. And yes, I'll do it.
I guess that partly answers my question, what we as Ukrainians can do to tell our story better to the world. We first of all have to do homework, right? And if we are asking for solidarity, we have to extend solidarity in the first place.
Extend solidarity, and also recognizing that as Ukrainians, even I think that in recognizing your privilege in relatively speaking in this conflict. So it's very clear to me in my reporting that Ukrainians who in the Western world function as whites take up white privilege outside of their Eastern European context. Many of, and to close it out, I was, one of the people, I had a conversation with somebody who spent 10 years living in the United States, and I was talking about racism in America, and I said, well, I feel like America and Russia, they both have imperial, histories of Ukraine, imperial past and present. I talked about Haiti, I talked about a number of countries. And this Ukrainian, who I know well, was like, well, I wouldn't compare them to Russia. I said, why? I said, I'm not saying that they're the same, but I do think that when you talk about colonization, so they have very similar threats. And she said, well, no, they don't. And then she started going into this odd conversation about being, going through a black neighborhood in Washington, D.C. And basically what she was saying was that this person, basically, this person feared that these black people were saying, well, hey, you dropped something. And she felt like she was being harassed. And I said, well, what happens? What happened? What did these people do to you? I'm like, did they grab you by your arm? They didn't even touch you. But she said, well, I felt harassed. I said, you know what? You sound like a Kieran. So, again, I'm showing you, I'm doing a 360 about my intellectual sojourn about race. I've done the homework, and I told her this. I spent more time studying more about you than you know about me. You lived in New York and Washington, D.C., two places that have some of the blackest populations in this country. Do you know anyone black besides me? Well, I know this person at work. Who do you know and care about? Man, more than a decade to do it and you couldn't do it. That is white privilege. To not even know someone who looks like me. Even in my own country, I could not do that. But you could. And you, with your white skin, could walk through this neighborhood and take up this presence of being a threat. I said, you have integrated into American whiteness. You're not even a citizen. I'll leave you with that.
Do we have time for?
Sorry, my name's Michael Cloud, and I am a journalist and social commentator, and anti-racism activist over here. Absolutely fascinated by your insights and the way that you used your blackness and knowledge of colonialization to have a different view and report in a different view from Ukraine. But I feel remiss if I feel like I'm always calling out white journalists for turning up in South London and trying to report on our stuff. And I go by the nothing about us without us thing. How, as good as you have been at seeing through a different lens, wouldn't the stories be better told by someone from Ukraine? What makes your voice? This isn't a criticism. I know.
Is that all you're asking me? Because this doesn't sound like a criticism.
Okay.
How do you know you're not being a black savior? Okay. Is that all you got to say?
That's all. Okay.
Really?
You might have taken offense by that. I don't know.
Jesus Christ. God, you people are nice. No, thank you for that question. Fine, this is a totally reasonable question. Thank you. So, no, I don't think that, I think that being a Westerner, even being a black American, I do have privilege. For example, I can come and go to Ukraine whenever I want. That's the first thing. Number two, as much as I can talk about police violence and all those things, I don't have to return to a country where people are dropping bombs on me. That's another thing, right? I don't have to worry about displacement. I don't have to worry about the genocidal acts of sexual assault, etc., that are taking place in Ukraine. And I think the way that to answer your question, I think that every human being is eligible to participate in some type of oppression against someone. Every human being can do that. And being black doesn't qualify us from that, And so much of it requires me to listen to Ukrainians because I get things wrong. And to me, I don't see those responses as make me defensive. I see them as opportunities. Because I'm not going to get things right. I have gotten things wrong. I think it's impossible not to get things wrong. And so I just have to remember and recognize, one, whose story I'm telling and always centering their voice. I'm just a conduit. And I think what's unique about me is that I'm independent, like yourself, we're both independent journalists, and I'm not able to, in the way that people respond to me is by me including my personal narrative, right? And I spent some time there trying to, present frameworks, but I engage so much in my own personal experience because it's what people ask for. In fact, Sasha, we were talking this morning, we were talking before we got here, talking about incorporating my own personal experience. That's what people keep asking for. And that's what's valuable to them. And so, because the vast majority of Ukrainians want that, I give it to them. And when that no longer is the case, I won't. But for the past 10 years, that has been the case. But simply recognizing how I'm able to come and go from the country and keeping an open ear is a way for me to never lose track of whose story I'm telling, because at the grand scheme of things, it's not mine. That is such a nice question. I'm gonna keep joking with you because I thought you was gonna talk about my mama. And I've had people say all types of stuff to me. I was in a, and I'm gonna say this because I want to give people, opportunity to talk there, but I've dealt with contentious people on Twitter, and God, what's that?
It can't get worse.
It can, yeah, but people, and I have a very, I think I'm a nice person, but I don't run away from a fight if you pick it with me, especially if you're being a jerk. Because what happens is that people say a whole lot of stuff to you on Twitter that they don't say to your face. And it's not a matter of being tough, it's just a matter of just being, what's the point of us having a dialogue? Are we supposed to grow from one another? And this one guy was, calling me all kinds of names. I was speaking at Howard University, HBCU in Washington, D.C. And this guy, I was doing a Q&A, and this guy said, hey, I'm so-and-so, and you blocked me on Twitter. My response was, I bet you were an asshole. And they said, yes, I was. And I looked at him, I said, well, how does it feel to be an asshole? And look at me square in the eye. What did you say? Can you repeat that to me? And they just kind of cringe up, because it just shows you how poor, social media gives a whole lot of people what I call digital courage, which is similar to liquor courage. You say things when you're not sober. So that's what I'm saying. Like, I've dealt with a wide range of people that I've confronted them, but brother, thank you. So I'm gonna leave that alone.
Do we have a question?
I'm fine to talk.
Yes, please.
So throughout your speech, but I came looking for a decolonisation of the Western coverage. I haven't really heard much about how you're removing the Western view from the coverage of Ukraine, because from what I understand, most of what you said kind of aligns with Western coverage. So it would be good to hear about what you think Western coverage is doing wrong and how we can position ourselves in a position which is more centered on the working class people in Ukraine.
Okay, that's fair enough. So I thought I did, but let me reiterate. So now the whole thing about, I focused on one main point, which was how did Western media coverage at the beginning get Ukraine's capacity to hold Kiev wrong. That's what I focused on. And what I want to reiterate, and if I'm not clear, please feel free to kind of interject, is that much of the coverage dealt with Ukraine will not hold for a week. Ukraine does not have the capacity to withhold. My contention is that the coverage, and even in my interviews, people were raising doubts about Ukraine being able to hold off the Russian offensive. My points were that one of the things that coverage got wrong was the fact that it did not consider that civil society, and that they about fighting corruption within the Department of, the Ministry of Defense, for example, and other areas of civil life, prepared Ukraine to hold up in ways that Western commentators did not delve into. And again, that is my observation of media coverage, and that is the observation of Ukrainians who I have spoken to. And so when I talk about decolonization, many of my talking points came from Ukrainians. And I did not, what I would do next time, and I didn't do it this time because this is more of a conversation, and what I would do if it was a course, for example, I would actually name all those voices, and I would actually play video of those people who talked about the ways in which, you know, it was Ukrainian civil society would not tolerate a Russian occupation. And so my argument is that that was not the coverage that was directed towards Ukraine. In my experience, and those of the ways in which Ukrainian observers saw it. I'll stop right there. Now, if that doesn't make sense, I'll add on to it.
No, that makes sense. So your argument is basically that the colonial view that came from the West, not the Eastern colonial view, the Western colonial view, is that Ukraine was.
Can you speak up? I'm sorry.
Sorry, I'll be louder. So you're saying your view of colonialism from the West, or the colonial Western coverage, is that the West underestimated Ukrainian battling powers.
Yes.
And then your decolonization of that is basically saying that Ukraine has more military power or capability than we expected.
No, it's not. Okay, so thank you for following up. I'm saying that it takes, you know, when you look at the think tank world, you think about a lot of the commentators who were talking about Ukraine, they understand military capacity. But that's not the only thing that's required to win a war, it's the will. Okay, here's what I want to remember.
So when I talk about military capacity, I'm just saying generally the ability to fight. I'm not talking about explicitly saying it's a tank or.
I get it, but yeah, so that's what made me be more specific, is that I brought up civil society in the lead up since 2014 because if the institutions that existed in 2014 existed in 2002, I would be worried. What I'm saying is that there was a major shift in civil society kept improving. Even as Russia, and I didn't mention, even as Russia occupied 20% of the country and occupied Crimea, right? There was still, civil society was still growing stronger and stronger and stronger. And part of that was that the military infrastructures were slowly being reformed in ways that would receive and adequately take advantage of Western support. That's one thing. And then also, when you have 200 people, I believe that's the number, and there are at least a couple hundred people who were killed during the digital Maidan. My argument is that when you look, Putin's framework was that we will be seen as liberators. What I saw in Ukraine over the past 8 years that I've been going there was a complete rejection of Russian authority. They literally, several hundred people, and I'm not going to stop naming a number, but good 100 people at least were killed fighting against the security services of Ukraine, defending former President Viktor Yanukovych until he fled to Russia, right? He's someone who I think Black America, in Black America we call it, a sellout. And he's somebody I think that Ukrainians, they the same phraseology will include for Viktor Yanukovych. Ukrainians would not accept Putin's overlord. They're not going to accept Putin himself. I'm saying that it is important to understand that there were notes and messages throughout the years of what Ukrainians would accept and not accept. One thing I did not mention in my talk is that in the 2010 presidential election, you had Viktor Yanukovych and a woman named Yulia Tymoshenko who had the braids, etc. And we're not going to deep dive into Yulia Tymoshenko. If you want to talk to me about it in champagne, and wine, whatever.
No champagne, I'm sorry.
Okay, wine, whatever. But here, oh yeah, you got excited. But anyway, let me get to your point. So basically, Ukraine more or less had 5 consecutive election cycles that were generally competitive. And in 2000, and one thing that was important to note is that during that election, the conversation about Russia's naval fleet that's in Sevastopol, there was a contract that was being debated about whether or not to increase the lease up through 2030s, right? And Yulia Tymoshenko said, no, we shouldn't do this. And so even though she was considered, like friendly with Moscow, so I'm not going to get into that, but the point was that that election where she lost, it was competitive and it was very close. I think she lost by like a couple percentage points. And so my argument deals with how much authority from Moscow are Ukrainians willing to tolerate. And even as early as 2008, it was very little, right? And so you constantly saw this kind of battle and this fighting with how, and it had less to do with how Ukrainians were emotionally connected to a person. It had more to do with how much of Russia's fear is this particular candidate going to allow. And over the years, that sphere got shorter, smaller, and smaller, and smaller, and smaller. And I think that as journalists, we have to be aware of this. And that led me to the culmination, among other things, that with those deaths, with those murders in 2014, and the improvements of and not only the civil society reforming, you also had intense fighting in the East where Ukrainians were gaining experience. And then walking around the streets is another thing. Leading up to the war, you had 8-year-olds learning how to shoot. And in fact, there is some major propaganda spreading around Russian circles. You saw this black Ukrainian kid that was like 7 years old firing an automatic rifle. And so they're saying, oh my God, they got children out there, teaching them to hate, Russians, right? And so
For no reason.
For no reason, right? And so you had all that, and there was an energy in Ukraine where people said, I would rather die than be under the rule of Russia. So you have to be there. That's the part where you have to be there. You can't be someplace else. You have to live in Ukraine. You have to have those conversations. And I'll close this out by saying that Malcolm X said something to me. He's a military analyst, United States. He said something very interesting. There's a reason why Russia and America failed to have full control over Afghanistan and the Taliban. America has the most powerful military in human history, yet they cannot suppress fully people running around with automatic rifles and flip-flops. They don't want you there. And Russia also is not used to fighting a war with a military or the experience of Ukraine. It fights people that you can eventually oppress and beat to submission. And Ukraine is a better foe than any of those countries combined. And again, I'm going to close out because I'm going to get into the landmass and how big, you need 1 million people to send into Ukraine. That was the first mistake. But again, I could again teach this this will take a class about why it just, even from a military strategic point, won't work, because it deals with it deals with Russia sending in columns, and like one column it didn't have, second one and the third one to kind of support it. But I hope did I do a better job of explaining that to you?
Yeah, no, I understood.
Thank
Do
you.
you mind if I add a few things?
Yes.
I was in Ukraine at the beginning of the full-scale invasion. I actually stayed there till pretty much September. And I was interviewed during those first weeks a lot by Western media. And every time when I told our esteemed cultural and media institutions that Ukraine would not surrender, I was treated as this naive, patriotic Ukrainian girl. My experience, my knowledge was absolutely dismissed. I was not heard, I was not listened to. I believe I have a better grasp of my country than any of those journalists who was interviewing me. Terrell has sense to listen to people like me, and many of people in the Western media in the privileged positions of power do not have this sense for some reason. And just I was struck by this resistance line that you were emphasizing. There is a line that our Jewish president, Volodymyr Zelensky, the Jewish president of the country that Russia proclaimed to be denazified, there is the line that Zelensky keeps saying, we'll be better off without light, but also without you, Russians.
That sounds
We'll
like
be better off without water than without you, Russians. This sounds like we.
it sounds like a rap lyric almost.
I'm getting into the swing here.
Right.
So this is just something about the will of Ukrainians to resist and to fight that was not recognized in the West.
And you have to, in the one sentence, you have to live there in order to appreciate what we're talking about.
Olesa?
Thank you. I'm Olesa, Project Director of Ukrainian Institute London. I really like you sometimes, depending on what people want to cover, whose voices are we not amplifying that we should be, and whose story should we be centering on?
Common people. So, if I were, we were talking about this earlier today. I'm an independent journalist, and you can relate to this. One of the things that is challenging about doing the type of work that I do is that, one, it would be very difficult to do this, or nearly impossible to do this if I worked at a major network. If I wanted to do that, if I wanted to be at a major network, I could. I choose not to. In addition to doing the journalism, I have to worry about the marketing, I have to worry about the ad sales, I have to worry about the business plan, I have to worry about setting up an infrastructure. I didn't have any infrastructure when I started doing this stuff, and I ran myself crazy. And now, when I leave here on Friday going home, I have to go to my apartment in Brooklyn and just sit my butt down for 3 months and work on the business and work on my project. I wanted to come to Ukraine. I can't do that because I have to work on the business, right? And so those stories about, the stories that I would want to tell if I had the bandwidth would be, I went out to Izium, and that's one of the liberated towns in eastern Ukraine. And I also went out to those sites where the mass genocides, the mass graves were, and it's, first of all, it's extremely traumatizing, but not obviously more so for the people who are actually there, but just witnessing that was just horrific. But there was a journalist there who was, there was a woman there who was at one of these main sites in Izium, and she was charging her laptop, because basically the infrastructure in this town was completely destroyed. And interestingly, I was kind of prepared. I had my sentences written out in Russian and Ukrainian, because the way I work is that, if there's certain topics I don't understand, I write out my questions just so I can be ready, and I practice my Ukrainian and my Russian multiple times just to make sure I can get it right. And I wanted to talk to this woman at the, who was sitting here charging her laptop, and she spoke perfect English. and she turned out to be a journalist who spent her entire time living under occupation. And her story, she had, usually we go to people who have the worst type of stories, and those stories definitely need to be centered, but there was a story about just what is it like when you're not dealing with the most horrific circumstances that are viscerally and physically happening to you. Like, what is it just like having being under a Russian police state in your own country, in your own city, where everything that you're doing is governed by somebody that has a Russian flag on their uniform. And I think that will help us to really understand that this decolonization coverage, because I think we look for the most salacious stories and the worst incidents, and we focus on the abuse and the assault. But I don't think that we spend much time just looking at being under the thumb of the criminal. Those are the stories that I would like to do, that I think that we really need to see, because I think that it will bring home what we're talking about.
Я вибачаюсь, може щось запитаю вас? Find out how you fact check these things. You know that big American directors and actor like Sean Penn and another guy, I think he did probably The Apocalypse Now. What were they doing in Ukraine before the start of the war, and how do you assess that story on the news?
The actor?
Yeah, I think he was there making like a major project or something like that.
I think he was doing a documentary somewhere in eastern Ukraine indeed.
I don't know. I honestly don't know. I wish I could. I have no idea.
We have time for the last question, so yes, please be very short. Sorry, who asked it there?
Because, for example, even someone like Navalny is actually now seen as a martyr, but in fact is at its supporter of imperial idealism.
Can you repeat that last part? I didn't hear you.
Sorry. So you said earlier that Ukraine will not support and accept Putin as an overlord. Is there a reason why you're saying it's Putin and not Russia itself? So, for example,
I did. Yeah.
it's support of imperial Russia and said some really unpleasant stuff earlier.
No, thank you for the clarification. Yes, and so you're absolutely correct. And that was I said Putin because he was at the top of my mind, but correct. They won't accept they won't accept anyone in Russia, as their overlord. And I'll close out with this by saying, but I said this earlier, but the vast majority of Ukrainians I know don't trust Navalny at all. They don't trust Russian liberals. Now, ironically, many people in the West do. And I think that this is, and the reason why is that I think that America's white savior complex extends over to people like Alexei Navalny. And I was having a conversation with my colleagues about an article I wrote about Navalny. And one thing I will say about him is that I do think that to a certain extent he very much is somebody who is fighting for a particular type of freedom in Russia. I believe that I think anybody who risks their lives and dies, they do that. I believe that part. That's where my positive notes of Navalny end. Okay? And I think, and this is a really important, thank you for that, thank you for allowing me to clarify, because this gets to an important thing. Eventually, when Russia does see a transition of power and somebody like Navalny does happen to get in, I don't think that Russia's policy towards Ukraine will change. I don't think that. And I think the dangers of this lionization of Navalny will blind us from will blind us to ignore the very real dangers of his type of rule. Because I think that he's just as colonial as everyone else. And, the last person that I think Ukrainians respect to a certain degree is Boris Nemtsov, right? To a certain extent. But there is no one in the Russian political discourse that I see as being a shift from the colonial construct that Russia possesses. And that deals with the decolonization process. I didn't want to spend too much time talking about Russian figures, but I think that that's a danger that we have, and I think that's the next step that we as Western journalists need to be aware of, is listen to Ukrainians who are determining their own regional security, because he's not going to, I don't see Navalny or anyone who's a Western liberal completely withdrawing their forces from Ukraine. I don't see them changing their political frameworks because, and this is more of a colloquial thing. Russians are far more obsessed with Ukrainians than Ukrainians will ever be about them. They don't, just traveling around the country, no one talks about what they don't care about them. Build your own country. Stop, develop your own world. Like, none of my friends, and I spent a lot of time in Ukraine, no one cares about what Russia is doing. They say you're just constantly poking your nose in our business. And I don't think that, and I think that that's the next challenge for Western coverage, is to not look at these people like Zhenya Sobchak, for example, the Washington Post, the New York Times labeled her as a Putin critic. We all know that's not true, right? But there's a white savior complex here, and that's part of the decolonization. But thank you very much.
Thank you. And thank you, Terrell, for
just this amazing talk and for holding the mirror in front of us, which is not only flattering. I think that's what hurt you, and we'll try to do our homework better. It's been very important to hear what you have to say.
I'm going to learn Ukrainian and I'm going to do all of my homework.
Let's continue learning from each other.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.